All right.
Hi, this is Paul, and this is a really special conversation between Bethel McGrew, who is no stranger to this channel, and Rod Dreher, who's been on the channel once or twice. We are having a conference in Chicago in August, and the link is below in the notes. We call it Midwestuary. It's Midwestuary 2025. And Rod Dreher and Bethel will be there, along with Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke and Elizabeth Oldfield and myself and Kel Zeldin. And so this is a really big deal for this little corner of the internet, as we call it, where we get together with just a whole bunch of people. We're going to do a fair amount of estuary breakout rooms, and I'm sure what we're talking about today will very much come up. I'm going to give a little bit of introduction, and then I'm going to give it to Rod, and then Bethel just wrote a review of Rod's latest book, Living in Wonder. But I want to give a little background on Rod. I think most of my audience knows who Rod Dreher is. A lot of people might imagine that it was Jordan Peterson that ruined my reputation in the Christian Reformed Church, but that is not true. It is probably Rod Dreher because I found Rod long before I found Jordan Peterson. And it was Rod that really began to change some of my ways of thinking about some things. And then I actually think I found Peterson through Rod's blog. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about Rod's blog, well, blogging is still alive with Rod in that your blogs, Rod, are incredibly personal and sort of like video, like people watch me and they sort of think they know me. I've watched you through a lot of your life go through and have written about it and have blogged about it, but also in your books. Your books are also very personal and they really give us a bit of a travel log of not just a physical journey, but a spiritual journey. And I think now that we have this, the United States bombing Iran, it sort of reminded me of some of your story of, I wonder if you might begin by telling us a little bit of your story of how the Iraq War sort of shocked you, your journey into Catholicism, your journey out of Catholicism, your journey into Orthodoxy. Because as Bethel, I don't know, Rod, if you've had a chance to read Bethel's review of your book yet, that she just put up on Substack, I think she's right that this is in many ways your most orthodox book, and a lot of ways a pretty strong apologetic for what I call right now sort of the orthodox moment.
hmm
So go ahead,
Well,
Rod.
yeah, so I wrote the book Living in Wonder. I intended it like I have done for my last two books, Benedict Option, Live Not by Lies, for all small O Orthodox Christians, Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox, who still believe that the Bible is authoritative, that truth is something objective that we have to conform ourselves to, not as opposed to we get to make it up as we go along. And I did intend it to be my most orthodox book, but I didn't intend it to like tell everybody, therefore you should become Eastern Orthodox. I think that there are certain things that the Eastern Christianity has to offer to Western Christianity right now that are important to us. That, but what I basically wanted people to do, if you get to the end of my book, I want you to want to know Jesus better. I want you to want to know Jesus in a more intimate way, and in fact, a more mystical way. I'm sure we'll get into this tonight when Bethel tells me how wrong I am, and I tell her that no, she's wrong. Anyway, a quick background though. I'm talking to you all tonight from Paris. I'm in a hotel room in Paris, which accounts for this weird background. I'm in bed in my tiny little room. Um, it was France that first helped me to become really Christian. I had been raised in a small town, Louisiana. We were Easter and Christmas Methodist, but cultural Christians. It didn't really matter. By the time I got to be a teenager, I knew that there was nothing to Christianity but middle class conformity or TV evangelism, neither of which I wanted. When I was 17 years old, 1984, my mother won a trip to Europe in a church contest. And she didn't want to go, but she knew that her son really wanted to see Paris and the museums and where Hemingway lived. So she sent me. I was the only young person on a bus full of elderly American tourists. I didn't care. I was going to Paris. So on the way to Paris, the bus stopped to see an old church about an hour outside the city. I didn't even want to get off the bus and go see an old church, but I did. And that's where I met God. This was the cathedral at Chartres, which I didn't know this at the time, growing up small town America, but this is one of the great treasures of Western Christianity, of all Christianity. A medieval cathedral, considered the highest example of Gothic. I walked in there, Paul, and I can't tell you what happened other than just the immensity of the stone, the vaulting arches, the stained glass, the rose window. I just looked around me and I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was real and that he wanted me. Now, I'd love to be able to say I walked out of there as a Christian, but I didn't. I walked out of there on a search. I felt that God revealed himself in some mystical way to me there in a way that I could not deny. And I went through college and different struggles to surrender to Christ. And I finally did surrender to Christ and became a Catholic because I had wanted to know the kind of God who had inspired his followers like 800 years ago to erect such a temple to his glory. Because I had not imagined this growing up in small town America that Christianity could produce this. So I became a Catholic in 1993. I was living in Washington, D.C., working as a journalist, and I was a very serious Catholic, doctrinally serious. But what I didn't realize was that, I had read my way into the Catholic Church, and I didn't realize that basically American Catholicism, at least at that time, was mainline Protestantism in most churches, but just with a little more high liturgy. But I became a very political Catholic, and I thought that the line between good and evil passed between the conservatives in the church and the liberals. Then ended up moving to New York. 2001, I got involved writing about the abuse scandal. This was before it broke big nationwide. That happened in January 2002. But I was writing about a case there in New York City. I was a columnist at the New York Post at that time. And I interviewed a very brave Catholic priest, Father Tom Doyle, who had basically sacrificed his career to speak out for victims. After the interview, he said, "Listen, Rod, I can tell you're serious about your faith. And I want to warn you that if you go deeper into this, you are going to go to places darker than you can imagine." And I said, "Well, Father, thank you for the warning, but I feel like I have to do this as a Christian, as a journalist, and as a father, a new father. I just had my first child." He said, "Oh, I'll help you any way I can, but you just need to prepare yourself. This is going to be dark." Well, there was no way I could prepare myself for what was coming. I'd always thought, Paul, that if I had all of the arguments, the doctrinal arguments, clear in my head, that I was living behind a fortress that could not be penetrated. And it wasn't true. For over the next 3 years, 3 or 4 years, writing about the scandal, I just couldn't imagine what I was dealing with. Now, I had Catholic friends who were every bit as angry as I was about the corruption in the church, and they didn't have a crisis of faith, but I did. And I think part of it was because I had been bullied in school and the adults wouldn't take care of it. So I think there was some trauma there. But I think mostly it was because my Catholicism was so intellectual. Now, I prayed, certainly, but I thought as long as I was thinking the clear thoughts, my faith was fine, and it wasn't. I finally got to the point where I just could not believe. And, Paul, I didn't imagine this was possible. I didn't realize the extent to which the will is involved in faith. But it's, to use an extreme example, I mean, if I had a Muslim reader of mine once say, "Why haven't you considered Islam, the arguments for Islam?" And the answer is, I don't have all the time in the world, and I don't want to consider the arguments for Islam because I think it's false. Now, he had a good point. How can you reject something you don't know about? But I bring that up to say that will has a lot to do with what we believe and what we allow ourselves to consider as plausible. I was living in Dallas then with my family. I ended up becoming Eastern Orthodox because, according to Catholic teaching, the Orthodox have valid sacraments. And I was still Catholic enough to where that mattered to me. And when my then wife and kids and I went into an Orthodox church in 2005 for the first time, I was overwhelmed by the presence of God there, by the in the sensuality of the church, meaning the icons, the heavy incense, the candles, the way they prayed. I felt like it elevated me. Now, I don't think God is necessarily more present there than he would be in a Catholic church or a Presbyterian church, but he was more accessible to me in a very dramatic way. We ended up coming into Orthodoxy in 2006. But when I came in on my knees. I had been so prideful intellectually as a Catholic, and that's not on the Catholic Church, that's on me. I remember when I became a Catholic thinking I'm on Team Richard John Newhouse now. That's, you know who he is, but some of our younger listeners won't. He was probably like the team captain of intellectual Christians in America for the 90s and the 2000s. And I wanted to be with the A team, with the smartest Christians, and of course it was the Catholics. And God humbled me in my arrogance, and I knew that when I became Orthodox, I had to focus on my prayer life and my own repentance, and I had to make a decision not to get involved with church politics, because I had thought for so long that, I mean, I was willing to argue about church politics, who are the good bishops, who are the bad bishops, etc., all day long. But that's not the same as being a Christian. In fact, my wife once said to me after hosting a bunch of us at the house one night in Brooklyn, uh, all of us were guys, right? The women, we never let them get a word in edgewise. We were talking about the church all night. And we said goodnight to the last guest. She looked at me and said, "We need a lot less Peter in this house and a lot more Jesus." And I thought that's a really profound thing to say. So anyway, I became Orthodox, and it just made me a different kind of Christian. I eventually lost the anger I had at the Catholic Church and came to see all the good that God had done for me in that church. But I also quit being so combative. I believe in the Orthodox faith, but I don't. When I was a Catholic, I was ready to argue with anybody and throw down and argue apologetics and all that. I just gave it all up because that orientation to the world was spiritually destructive for me. I'm not putting apologetics down at all. There's a place for them. But I myself, because my intellectual arrogance had unhorsed me, I couldn't let that happen again. And so I've been Orthodox now for almost 20 years. I'm happily Orthodox. Whenever I see Catholics, I went on here in France a couple of weeks ago, I went on pilgrimage to Chartres. There's a 3-day walking pilgrimage. It starts at Saint-Sulpice Church in Paris. 20,000 young people walk for 3 days, converging on the cathedral at Chartres the Monday after Pentecost. And I was there. A lot of people recognize me because my books are fairly well known in Europe, and they're all like, "Are you coming back? Are you coming back?" I'm like, no, I'm happy as an Orthodox, but we shared Jesus. Let's praise God together. So that's pretty much my story. Now, you asked, I'll say briefly about the Iraq War. It's interesting to think, Paul, about how I lost my Catholic faith around the same time I lost my faith in the Republican Party and in conservative politics. In 2002, when we were marching up to the Iraq War, I was 100% behind it because I was living in New York City on 9/11. I saw the South Tower fall with my own eyes, and I was so traumatized by it that I thought whatever the government says to justify blowing some Muslims up, I was in favor of it. I didn't put it to myself that crudely at the time. I would have, refused it had it been that crude, but I dressed it all up in intellectual justifications. And I remember reading like Patrick Buchanan, Robert Novak, and people on the right who I normally would trust. They were against the war. But I said, oh, they're either cowardly or they're foolish. We have to do this war. 3 years on, when the war was such a disaster, I had to face the fact that I had rationalized it all. And I had rationalized my desire for vengeance. And that made a big, big impact on me. And it made me much less of a believer in politics. I'm still a conservative, but I ended up leaving the Republican Party. And I don't think that I think there's a role for politics, but I'm far more interested in religion and culture than I was in politics back in the day.
Now, talk to me a little bit about Live Not by Lies. You came to an event in Sacramento, and I met you briefly at that event. And I remember you were talking in that a little bit about some of the things that you would lead up to living in wonder. I'd like to talk a little bit about enchantment, and we'll use that word for now because it's the word that you use. Um, I think there's a lot to talk about with respect to that word.
Right.
But why did you write the kind of book that you did? Because I think, again, one of the things that I've noticed about you, Rod, is I'll often read you and I think, oh, he's kind of alarmist. Oh, it's a little overstated. But then things, things sort of come about. And it's like, I remember reading Rod about this and thinking he was a little alarmist. And then here we are. So,
I have eerie powers, Paul Vanderclay. You know what it is? This is going to sound weird, but I have developed this theory that I think I'm slightly autistic. But and I'm not kidding because one of my kids is very slightly on the spectrum, and he got it from somewhere, and I think that somewhere is me. I think I just have a knack for being able to see deep cultural patterns. I wish I saw patterns of the stock market. I'd be rich, but um, and I began to think relatively early in my career that if we accept this premise and this premise, then this is what's likely to happen. And it goes back to like 2005 when the I think it was 2005 or 2006 when the U.S. Senate refused to vote out the federal marriage amendment. Some conservative Republicans had put forth an amendment to enshrine one man plus one woman exclusively in the Constitution. And when a Republican Senate would not vote that out and send it to the states, I knew we were done. Our side was done. And I remember starting to write about that and saying that we on the Christian right had better recognize how perilous our position is and use what influence we have now, which was considerable, to fight for strong religious liberty protections and law. I got massacred by a lot of people on our side who are like, what do you mean we should give up now? The public is on our side and, blah, 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 which was true at the time. But what I don't think they saw, and I was able to see for whatever reason, is how very thin the support for traditional marriage was. Because what the gays were asking was basically for the way that heterosexuals had already come to see marriage as nothing but a contract. They just wanted that. And if heterosexuals had ceased to see marriage as being somehow intrinsically related to transcendence, then the game was up. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And by the time the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell in 2015, with the media campaigns and there was overwhelming media campaigns, and the churches didn't seem to know what to do, how to talk about marriage anymore, and it was gone. So I that was an early example of being able to see patterns and to talk about legal. I was talking to lawyers back then, religious liberty lawyers, who realized how weak our position was, but you didn't raise money by talking about we're really in a weak place. So we going forward to Live Not by Lies. I conceived the book around 2015 after I got a call one day from a physician, a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic. We had a mutual friend. He called me and told me that his elderly mother had spent 6 years in a Czechoslovak communist prison camp in the 50s for being a spy for the Vatican. Well, what she had actually done was she refused to stop going to Mass. So they imprisoned her and tortured her. She got out, came to America. Now she was living in 2015 with her son and his family. She said, son, the things I'm seeing happen in America now remind me of what it was like when the communists first came to power in Czechoslovakia. And specifically, she was talking about what was in the news that week, where Memories Pizza. Do you remember Memories Pizza? The little evangelical-owned pizza parlor. It was subject of death threats because they didn't want to cater a gay wedding. Well, I thought that was really extreme, this old woman saying that. And my mom is old and she watches a lot of Fox News and the Muslims are coming, the Muslims are coming. But the more I would get out into the world, going to conferences and talking to people who had come to America from the Soviet bloc, I would put the question to them. This was at the beginning when wokeness was really getting going. They all said the same thing as this old lady. And if you talk to them long enough, they would get really angry because Americans would not take them seriously. It can't happen here because our idea of totalitarianism comes from Orwell and from the Soviet Union. We don't have gulags here. We don't have the secret police. What are you talking about, totalitarianism? But those people sensed something deep in the way Americans were starting to think about things that was ultimately totalitarian. And I eventually wrote the book. It came out after my book, The Benedict Option. I wrote the book, and it became, fortunately, it came out 5 months into COVID. And by then, the book sold itself. I got almost no media interviews for it, but it ended up selling 220,000 copies, but mostly by word of mouth. Because people by then, I mean, I finished the book before, just as COVID was starting. COVID doesn't even come up in the manuscript, but people had seen how lies, the effect that lies can have. And they had also lived through the summer of George Floyd and seen how thoroughly ideological businesses, institutions, and the media had become around an ideological cause. And there was no dissent from it. If you dissented, you were a racist. This book, which was, I wrote the book, but it's the testimonies of these people and my analysis of them. It helped people, ordinary Americans, understand what was going on and how we could resist it. And now, by the way, I should say that Angel Studios has a 4-part documentary series out. You can watch it on angel.com, featuring interviews with some of these Christians who stayed behind the Iron Curtain and who resisted, telling us their stories and giving us advice. But Living in Wonder, my most recent book, the one we're going to be talking about at the Midwestuary, it's a book about Christian re-enchantment. Now, I too have problems with the word enchantment because when I hear it, I think of it in a trivial way, like, oh, Disneyland is enchanting. Or I think about it in sort of quasi-occult ways. And I don't mean that at all. What I mean simply is recovering the idea, the reality that God is, as we say in the Orthodox Church, say God is everywhere present and fills all things, that we live in a world filled with ultimate meaning because it is grounded in God. C.S. Lewis talked in his final book, The Discarded Image, about the medieval model. The Christians of the Middle Ages, they saw that everything had ultimate meaning that was intrinsic to it. Everything was connected in some sort of mysterious hierarchy that the great chain of being, and that life had ultimate purpose. I think we've lost that over the last, since the Renaissance, getting down to the time we're in now. And to be honest, Paul, this obviously is not in the book because it just happened. When I was there on the Chartres pilgrimage, talking to these young, all Catholics, mostly French, but from all over Europe, talking to them about why are you here? They all said the same thing. We live in a world where there is no path forward. There's nobody was willing to talk about meaning. We don't know what to do. We're hungry for God, but they're hungry not only from God in their hearts, but for a sense of direction and purpose. And they feel that they all like the Latin Mass. They're not fanatics about it, but they like the Latin Mass. They like the idea of pilgrimage, of using their body in a 3-day form of worship. They walk there praying and singing the whole time. They get together at night and pray together. And it just struck them as something that was done by Christians from time out of mind. It struck them as something that can help re-enchant their lives, in the sense that when they go back to their lives, living ordinary life in the world, they've had this experience of community, of praising God in community, and going to this extraordinary church where they get, where all around them, the stones and the glass testifies to the glory of God in the same way it reached me when I was 17. So I got it, why these kids are delighted by this, because that's how God first reached me.
Let's talk a little bit about, it's interesting that your book came about, pretty close to Ross Douthat's book, which I think is a nice pairing with it. And also Spencer Klavin's book, which is less well known, but I don't know if you've read Spencer's book, Light of the
Yeah, I
Mind,
did.
Light of the World, which I think is also an excellent book. And these three books, I think, are an attempt to sort of re-knit the world together in a way that's beyond sort of how it's collapsed. I haven't read Douthit's book yet, but I've seen him speak plenty about it. And of course, Douthit talking about both in terms of his mother's own journey into let's say into charismatic
Yeah.
Catholicism.
Yeah. She
Douthit's
was Pentecostal first and then
right.
became charismatic Catholic. Yeah.
And of course Douthit's journey with Lyme's disease. And many people have now had experiences with diseases that it could be long COVID, sometimes a vaccine injury in terms of Bethel's mother. There's a
Sorry,
lot going on that is shaking the paradigm that has been sort of holding the West for years.
yeah.
And that shake and collapse in terms of individuals' life. John Vervaeke, of course, calls it the meaning crisis. I mean, so then we sort of grasp for an idea that the world is alive in a way that all of us together in polite company had assumed was dead. Sure, there are outliers. We will allow them their craziness in their Pentecostal churches or in their charismatic movements, or maybe the Orthodox with their weirdness, but the world is not dead. So, Bethel, maybe this is a good time for you to jump in and talk a little bit about how you come into this, because I would, I'm not a skeptic of the woo. I was a foreign missionary. I was raised in an inner city context. When people say things like, "Of course miracles don't happen," I just laugh because you see plenty of things. And so, but Bethel, you're sort of, I think, in some ways, still sort of in the analytical modernist camp to a degree, but one who sort of held the apologetic keep to say, we are not going to, there are good reasons, even within a modernist frame, to not discount these things. And, maybe we've burned Descartes in effigy too quickly. So
Yeah,
go ahead,
I think
Bethel.
so. Well, so first of all, I just want to say, Rod, it's really lovely to be with you. And my mom read Rod long, long ago, and Rod read my mom, and so there's some family history actually here. And I mean, in fact, I was chatting with Rod when he came up with the title for "Live Not by Lies," and so I can say I was there when. So it's just well, lots of neat connections there. Rod's been
Yeah.
super generous in my own little career. He's boosted. I always when I get a little trickle of new subscribers, I'm like, oh, did Rod boost a thing of mine? So just thank you. It's really great to be here. So yeah, a lot that I could say. I should just so on miracles. I'm not a cessationist. So I don't have any principled notion that well, maybe like salvation history, miracles happen then, but now the canon is closed and they don't happen anymore. I don't think that. I don't think there's any principled reason to believe that. I also, just funny enough, just this past weekend, I was doing a little retreat with my parents and some friends with their apologetics ministry, and I met a man who's doing missions work in India, and he was speaking very matter-of-factly about the demonic, the miraculous, and how they have this little missionary outpost in the middle of this demonic stronghold. And my mom asked, so now when you say demonic, you mean literally demonic? He goes, oh yeah, literally. We've got cannibals and da da da. So it's just like, okay, well then. So I do tend to think that this sort of stuff is maybe even more alive and active in places like India or Paul, I think you were in, was it the Dominican Republic where you were? Okay. So yeah. Um, so I'm not at all skeptical of the woo in that sense. But I think I do tend to be a little bit more cautious and maybe withhold judgment some more on whether woo is the inference to the best explanation is an inference to woo. I'm not always sure if that's necessarily the case in every instance, especially when you talk about like, so, my Indian missionary friend says these people are demonic. I'm probably going to believe him. If Tucker Carlson says, oh, yeah, I got attacked by a demon in the night, I'm a little more skeptical, I guess. So, yes, these things are context dependent, I think I would say. Um, Also, just quickly, I don't obviously have as rich or colorful a personal background as Rod does, but I do want to just say a little bit about my background because I think it's maybe somewhat interesting here. So I grew up, I talk about this in my review of the book. I grew up kind of multilingual in a way, denominationally multilingual. So there was evangelical influences in there, certainly, but I also attended a very liturgical Anglican church. So, a lot of evangelicals, if they had wandered in there, they would have thought it was a Catholic church, because of the way the priest dressed and the altar and the sacrament, that kind of stuff. It was a breakaway from the Episcopal Church. So I kind of have the main line in my DNA in a weird way, which makes all your work on the death of the mainline kind of interesting. Um, so I'm a bit of a denominational orphan, I suppose. I You could say I'm an evangelical, but I'm a kind of an adopted evangelical in that I speak the language. I can get along with them, I can communicate with them, but I never quite fit in. And there's nowhere I really quite fit in, really. And so, I think I've always identified with misfits a little bit. Uh, and maybe that's why I also appreciate the personal quality of Rod, your journey and all the ways that you've sometimes felt like this world isn't your home. I can understand a little bit what that feels like, what that's like. Um, so there you go, just a little bit about my background. Also, as a little kid, I think I would say I was more porous. It's like Dreher talks about the porous self, the buffered self. I was a very porous little kid. I was always trying to feel the feels, like
Well,
play,
let me stop you there, Bethel. Why
yeah,
don't
go ahead.
you clarify for the listeners the porous self versus the buffer self? This is Charles Taylor's.
Yeah, right. That's Charles Taylor's phrase. So, and I mean, you've read way more Taylor than I have, but I mean, my very brief understanding from your book is um, he talks about porous, meaning that you have a sense of being very, very close to God. You have a
Open.
sense of
Yeah.
like the thin spaces, right? Um,
Right. Right.
like a constant interaction and like, oh yeah, I'm right there and God is right there with me. Um, and then with modernism, you have a more of a buffered self where I'm here and God is way up there and maybe he's communicating with me and maybe he's not, but we're sort of there's more of a distance there. Um,
Yeah, and not just God, but spirits themselves. I mean, this is one
or the
thing to
spiritual realm. Yeah, sure.
right,
Yeah.
right, to
Yeah.
take a little diversion. I think it's important. I don't want to interrupt you, but I think it's important.
Sure. Good to
Um,
clarify. Yeah.
One of the things that I write about in Living in Wonder is the whole weird hypothesis, capital WEIRD.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
and very briefly, about 20 years ago, so a Harvard anthropologist, Joe Henrich, and his team discovered that all of our psychology studies had almost all of them had been done on Westerners, usually college students. And so what people thought of as human psychology was actually Western psychology, and that there are psychologies around the world. There are people who are distinct in their psychological profile. And what they ended up doing, they came up with this wonderful acronym, WEIRD, standing for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic.
That's it.
People who grow up weird, as all of us have done in the industrialized world, in the so-called first world, we have a particular psychology. And one aspect of that psychology, he says, is that we are, well, he doesn't use this word, but we are more buffered. We are much less open to the idea that we live in a spiritual world in the sense that someone in the Dominican Republic or India would, thinking that spirits are all around us. And they even, Tanya Luhrmann, who is another person I draw on, she's an anthropologist at Stanford. She has found that the experience of the spirit of evangelical congregations in Southern California, in India, and in Africa are all rather culturally dependent. And the evangelicals, the charismatic evangelicals, even in Southern California, they are more buffered than their co-religionist in India and in Africa. Anyway, go back. I just wanted to clarify that because
Sure. Yeah.
it adds, I think, to what you're talking about, your own sense of being buffered.
Yeah. So, and I don't necessarily, I mean, I think those are sort of nice little hooks, but I don't necessarily buy Taylor's whole intellectual history. And Paul was kind of alluding to that there. I do think we've rushed to burn Descartes in effigy too quickly. And um, I I'm just not necessarily sure that this is all that Descartes is kind of where this all began. And I do think you can retain a very strong sense of living in a spiritual realm, even if you lack as strong a confidence or a enchanted feeling, I guess. So I think what I was beginning to pinpoint there was that um, I was trying very hard to chase feelings as a kid, um, and I was trying to induce feelings with the right prayer techniques or the right music, the right worship music or whatever. Um, like at night, I would just obsess and fixate over things, and it was a really sweet season in my life because I was very tender to God and to the things of the Spirit, which I'd like to think that I still am. I don't think I've lost that. Um, but at the same time, I can also look back and I can see I was definitely very OCD, probably clinically, probably still am. Um, that's not something I've really talked about much before, but I'm probably on the spectrum, like you, Rod, which is another reason why I appreciate what
Yeah,
Debbie
I
was
was
over.
OCD as a kid.
Yeah, I mean, I was probably like off the charts, and looking back, I just see just some of the odd things I did. I was like, oh, that's OCD. Yeah, that's classic, Aspie autistic behavior, which, as I got older, I've learned to, correct for that. And, you interact more with people. I was homeschooled, so I was in kind of a bubble. But then you get older and you kind of realize you're acting a little strange and you start to become more of a high functioning autistic, which is kind of where I am now. Um, and so, I think in hindsight, as I look at some of the things that at the time I might have read, like, oh, I got this great connection to God, God is speaking to me. Um, I think, well, you know, I obviously God was there, obviously God heard me, God loved me, God received my worship. I believe all of that is true, but I'm not sure if in those moments I had actually tapped into something or if it really was just that I was obsessively focused on my feelings. And this sort of can get into some of the Tanya Luhrmann stuff that you highlight because she's, like a good cultural anthropologist. She's surveying all kinds of cultures, not just Christian cultures, but
Right.
also pagan cultures, right? Um, and she's observing, well, if you believe that God is going to talk back to you, then you're more likely to have a sense that God has talked back to you, which makes good psychological sense, right? Um, and these kinds of techniques or whatnot. And then you include as a warning, now look, she's observed this in pagan context as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, and maybe we can get into a little of that. And Paul, I don't know how you want to guide this, but that's definitely an important
Yeah.
point of
I would say she was observing demons at work. That's what I would say.
Well,
could be.
And
Bethel, in your review, you quote Rod, so I'll pull you two together in this. What true enchantment, in quotes, really is simply living within the confident belief that there is deep meaning to life, meaning that exists in the world independent of ourselves. That's key because in this frame, we sort of have a sense, okay, well, feelings are things that I generate. And often feelings are dismissed as merely things that, let's say, my hormones generate, something of that sort. But there's a world of that exists independent of ourselves. This is living with faith to that meaning and know that meaning and commune with it. To that end, it is vital for us to learn how to perceive the presence of the divine life, the divine in daily life, and to create habits that open our eyes and our hearts to Him. Otherwise, people like that young evangelical student will never find their way out of the dark wood of modernity. Our civilization's disenchanted evening will never end.
That's a little bit of my wording in there, but yeah,
Yes.
yep.
And when I think I for a long time had taken issue with the fact that we use a word like miracle or supernatural, which is a relatively late word. Those words sort of frame the world in a way that I think when I look at the world, the work of, say, Jonathan Pageau, John Vervaeke, that of course we've been engaging with for a long time now, there is a resistance to a certain dualism that people blame Descartes for setting up, and a hunger for a unified world, which of course C.S. Lewis writes about in the Discarded Image. And if you go all the way to the end of that book, C.S. Lewis says, well, it's such a beautiful world. The only problem with it is that it wasn't true. Which of course, but in what aspect wasn't it true? And as you know, of course, I've made a lot of videos on my channel about this question. Well, what exactly are we talking about? Because we're recognizing that a certain collective cultural way of approaching the world that has been deeply powerful and deeply productive for the West, that in many ways has given the West hegemony over the rest of the world, is itself coming undone. And of course, I remember a cardiologist out of Idaho mentioned to me, part of the reason for the rise of new atheism was probably somewhere below the waterline. They were beginning to feel that that approach was beginning to slip away. And sort of like Rod, they felt it before many of the rest of us felt it, and they expressed it in that little bubble that became new atheism. But now with younger generations, we are beginning to see a much larger abandonment of that way of approaching the world, which leads to a far greater openness to, in Charles Taylor's words, a porous universe where, I think one of the areas that it's especially obvious in is sort of the translation of aliens, which sort of captivated us in the 1950s with all those alien movies. Aliens were products of evolution in other star systems that have sort of reached an evolutionary process by which they achieved, they were sort of on our trajectory, maybe a little bit ahead of it, and therefore they could reach out to us. But for the most part, aliens existed in a plane like our own. And a lot of what we see in Rod and yours book, let's say Seraphin Rose, of course, came before this with the suggestion that, and of course, C.S. Lewis, when you look at his space trilogy, he was there a lot earlier and said, hey, now, wait a minute. What if we actually were able to not throw away everything we knew from the discarded image and said, what might actually be happening with close encounters and alien abductions and some of these things? And so, I mean, I think that's probably the part of your book, Rod, that gets the most difficult for probably a lot of, let's say, evangelical Christians to read and think, because
Right.
suddenly their formation in a particular worldview now gets exposed by some of these suggestions that, but that then also throws, if your perception of aliens sort of comes and gets intertwined with your conversation about demons, that's going to provoke a question of, for a long time we've sort of had agreement on what we think are demons and angels. And it was my second conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, which began to dawn on me, like, there's a whole lot of other categories that are
Hmm.
getting moved around for us. And probably a lot of that is happening so subtly. When we talk about principalities and powers, we were thinking Frank Peretti, this present darkness. And now when we talk about principalities and powers, we're thinking, well, is wokeness a principality? How does that work?
You
Like,
know, go ahead, Bethel.
well, yeah, I was just gonna jump in. So, some of the stuff Tara Isabella Burton is, chronicles about, like, these Silicon Valley seances. It's like that hideous strength is nonfiction. It's like a meme on Twitter, that hideous strength is nonfiction. It's like, golly gee, let's dedicate this computer to the Egyptian god Thoth. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, I tell that story in my book.
Yeah, you do. Yeah,
That
it's
guy
like,
went to my high school,
he did.
and
Oh my gosh, wow.
yeah, it was like long
Oh,
after I
right.
left, but
Yeah.
genius guy
But
apparently.
so I think, what I would want to say, and I think I got to this actually a little bit more in a previous post that I wrote on demons and AI, um, which is that I'm completely 100% there on the minute that people go meddling, um, and trying to summon stuff, and like, here, let's see what happens if we, have a little ceremony, and let's, draw some circles and say some incantations. I wonder what'll happen. I want to say bad things. Bad things will happen if you do that sort of stuff. So let's not and say we did. Um, but where I think I do struggle a little bit more, and I'm just not quite sure how to assess certain stories, or what factors exactly are in play, is when it's Christians who are involved. So like in your book, you have this story about this Catholic couple where the poor wife seemed to be manifesting what might classically be considered signs of demon possession. And you're there and you witness some of this, and you're just kind of writing down what you see. And I'm kind of scratching my head, like, gosh, I'm not sure. But then I look in my review, I point to this German girl who she inspired the exorcism of Emily Rose.
Hmm.
And it was this whole, like, we actually have tape recordings. You can go look up these, supposed exorcisms that were being recorded. But later, the Catholic Church actually flipped and decided, actually, now we think she was mentally ill. She wasn't demon possessed. Which,
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
yeah,
well, let me point out to the listeners that the story you're talking about is a real story with Catholics I knew in New York, like Upper East Side. He's a stockbroker or something. But when she manifested for the first time, and they applied to the Archdiocese of New York, the Catholic Church has a formal procedure that if they're going to consider
right.
you for a formal exorcism, you have to be examined by a medical professional to rule out any possible natural explanation. And she was, and the doctor said, we can't explain this. So he approved her for the exorcism, though curiously, the Archdiocese of New York never provided her that. She finally, after years later, was delivered, but it was wild. And it turns out that she had ancestors back in Italy who had been open occultists, and that's how this all came about. But yeah,
And
I mean,
she's not
and
the
I
only.
remember.
Oh, sorry, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Well, I was just going to
I was
say,
just going to say.
yeah, okay. We're just,
All right,
well,
I was just going to say that I tell the story in the book. Her husband, after I was visited them and saw the demon manifest through her, he was walking me back to my hotel, and I said, "Dude, how has this changed you?" Because before they were just ordinary church-going meat and potatoes Catholics. He said, "When I walk the streets of Manhattan now, I realize that all around me there's a great spiritual battle going on, but we just can't see it. And everybody is in a spiritual battle." And I watched him because he was pious before, but now, man, he is a rock. He has loved his wife through that. And it's been really, really tough. And for those kids too. But I just connected him. I met a guy a couple weeks ago in Budapest. He was visiting an American who lives elsewhere in Europe. And his wife is divorcing him. And he said she started behaving so strangely 3 years ago. And she had become a witch, an actual witch, casting spells and things. And my friend, the New York guy, Nathan, I call him in the book, said, I want to help this guy. So I connected them, and now they're working. So this, once you get, I don't know, guess you could say red pilled on this world, when you've seen things yourself and you've watched it happen to people who are credible, um, you can't turn away from it, or it's very hard to turn away from it. And I tell the story. Paul mentioned aliens a second ago. There's a reason. The first story I tell in the book is about a Catholic who was visited by aliens, because I wanted people to know this is not going to. This is a Christian book, but it's not going to be a standard.
normal,
Here's some
nice, normal
miracles.
Christian book. Yeah, that's not.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of that too, but there's some weird. Like this guy contacted me when I first started writing on my Substack about aliens, because I had laughed at the whole thing until a friend of mine in Rome, who is a really sensible, believing Catholic journalist, said, "Listen, Rod, you better take this stuff seriously, because there's more going on there religiously than you probably think." And he was right, because my understanding of aliens and UFOs was stuck in like the first season of the X-Files in the early 90s. Anyway, this guy contacted me. He's a lawyer in Chicago, and he said, I don't gotta talk to somebody about this. I'm afraid to talk to my priest because I think he'll think I'm crazy." And to make a long story short, he saw a UFO when he was a teenager driving down the country road. He didn't tell anybody about it because I ended up meeting the guy, and he's very conservative. He didn't want people to think he was crazy. And then 7 years, I think, went past, and they started visiting him. And he didn't know what was going on. He thought he was losing his mind. He went to the hospital and demanded a blood test and a brain scan. He was fine. And then when he got married, his wife saw them too. And I said to him when we were on the phone talking about it, I said, "Did you ever pray? You're a Christian. Did you ever pray in front of them?" "Well, yeah." "Well, what happened?" "Well, they went away." I said, "Didn't that tell you this might be demonic?" He said, "I hadn't thought about it that way. I always thought if they were demons, they would want to fight me." I said, no, I've talked to exorcists about this and they've dealt with this. Don't talk to your priest about it. Go to the archdiocesan exorcist. So we did. The exorcist told him, yeah, we've dealt with this. He prayed over him. All the visits stopped. Now, and I've heard stories like this since I wrote the book from other people. When you talk to exorcists, they do deal with this. And we've got to find a way to talk about this. It might not necessarily be exactly what this exorcist thinks it is, but it's real. It's
Yeah.
something's going on there. I think it's demonic. I could be wrong about some of that, but I do not at least I believe that the phenomenon is real and it is not of God.
I think we are on the verge of having a much deeper shift in terms of our assumptions about what we categorize as real. And this is sort of where, let's say, some of the things I've learned from John Vervaeke come into view, because we see and don't see, according to Rod, it was you that had what is the guy's name? Daniel Everett. Don't sleep, there's snakes. The story
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
begins there.
That's a
I was
heartbreaking
just at
story. I
Synod and
remember that story.
I'm sitting down at a table and we're talking about how the food has been during our Synod time there. And someone says, well, should I get you ice cream? I said, well, I've been eating in this dining hall for 6 days. I haven't seen ice cream once. And I turn and there's this little thing that has ice cream in it. And it's like, well, why haven't I seen that ice cream? And this is a very pedestrian, normal thing. But, when I look at, for example, what my favorite tag for Jordan Peterson is that he's sort of like the unauthorized exorcist of Mark 9, because part of what has been going on in our culture, when I got into a lot of this stuff because I was having all of these conversations with young men who would tell me things like, they would describe their life before, and I'd listen to them. I think they were pretty depressed. And then they'd start to listen to hours of Jordan Peterson's classroom lectures and then biblical series lectures, and the depression would lift. And I thought, what does it mean that listening to videos can lift depression? And a lot of these categories that we've sort of assumed to be set in stone, categories of mental illness, um, have, these categories have shaped us in a way that you see this in biblical studies. You look at the kinds of deliverance that Jesus does with people, and people say, oh, when you look at that, that's epilepsy, and then Jesus. And so again,
Explaining
we
away.
hear these stories
Yeah.
through categories. And
Yeah.
what I think we are in the midst of is it's going to be a slow change, but a changing of these categories. And I don't think it's going to be simply, let's say, a translation into the world of the Haitians in the Dominican Republic that I began my ministry listening to. It's going to be a far weirder world, which is going to be postmodern, whether we use the word metamodern or what, but where AI is suddenly going to be involved. We're going to understand what we mean by demons and angels and mental illness. I mean, part of what happens in the Reformation is that the Catholic Church has to sort of keep up to speed with Protestants, which changes that. And that's part of the reason, I think, for the fact that with the fall of the Iron Curtain and the coming of the Orthodox to America, that now suddenly we have this other interesting cultural shift, because the Orthodox themselves didn't pass through what Latin Christendom had to pass
Right.
through. And
There
so
was no
now,
Reformation.
yes, so now we're getting this interesting new swirl, which I think, quite frankly, is going to be quite a profound movement that I don't think any of us quite know where this goes. But all of these categories that were sort of, we imagined, had foundations and set in stone, had footings in modernity. A lot of these are going away. This is where sort of Bethel and I often sometimes spar, because I'm looking at these categories and saying things are going to get really strange for a lot of people.
Well,
And even, when I read some of your book, I think when I see people, telepathy tapes, I don't know, Rod, if you know much about this.
Kale was trying to get me into that. I
Yeah.
haven't watched it yet, though.
So I've listened to a bunch of the telepathy tapes podcast. And one of the things that you notice about weird people is that immediately when something spooky or wooey happens, our mapping impulse goes into overdrive. And you can see that amongst Pentecostals who develop this entire theology, and they'll write manuals about, you can think of Bethel Church in Reading, suddenly, okay, we're going to map this. And it's like, I think we also have to sort of pull back from some of that mapping and recognize there's a lot here that is beyond us. We certainly have some key biblical injunctions about some boundaries that we are and shouldn't cross. But I think part of it is something which is deeply offensive to our imagination, which is we've had tools to map a lot, but this region is something that we may never have tools to create the kinds of maps that we want because, obviously it's colonizers that deeply desire maps in order to, and these are just areas in many ways beyond us.
Maybe can I say, throw in my kind of
Yes, please do. That's why you're here.
Spoil sporty modernist Christian thought. Well, so this intersects some, and I think Rod, you said you haven't read Ross Douthat's latest book, but there's
Oh, I have.
you have?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, so there's some overlap here with what Ross is working on and what you're working on, because Ross is, of course, also, and I mean, he was the one who told you to write your Woo book, right? Um,
Yeah.
so, I mean, what's interesting to me about Believe, Ross's book, is um, some parts of it, Ross sounds very modernist. Like he sounds like he's kind of putting on his like pointy, nerdy apologetics Christian hat, and he's talking about the fine-tuning argument or whatever. And then he'll switch into this woo mode where he's talking about, you know, crazy supernatural woo stuff. Um, and one thing he's interested in is near-death experiences. And he talks about how if you look at people across different religious traditions and the kinds of experiences that they report or the sorts of figures they see, it varies depending on what their cultural religious background is. So, if you're a Christian, you're more likely to say, "Oh, I saw the Virgin Mary," or "I saw a saint," or "I saw Jesus." But if you're a Muslim, you might see, I don't know, Muhammad or something. If you're a Buddhist, you might say, "Oh, I saw this Buddhist goddess," or something like that. Um, so Roz's takeaway from that is, well, all these people, he's thinking, his reasoning is they're all accessing some transcendent supernatural something, some layer. They're all kind of touching, however you want to think of that. But then it's just that it's getting filtered through their particular uh, cultural backgrounds, which is why you get these, it's like a prism, and it's refracting, and you get all these different kinds of stories. But I look at those stories with, like very contradictory ideas of what the afterlife is going to look like and who we're going to see there, right? Like these stories can't all be true. And, of course, if Peterson were here, what do you mean by truth? And we're not going to, let's please not go there. But, in terms of like, I believe I'm going to see Jesus in the afterlife. There's this old song by a Christian rock band, it won't be old Buddha that's sitting on the throne. It won't be old Muhammad that's calling us home, right? It's, good old evangelical soft rock. And so then I'm inclined actually to kind of look at those near-death experiences type stories and say, I suspect maybe these are actually, kind of rooted in a more boring, naturalistic kind of explanation where, something sort of like when we dream at night, something just gets unlocked when we come that close to death, and it stirs up all of the thoughts we've ever had about who we might see in the afterlife, and then we come back with these varied experiences. Um, so, and I know that's very mundane. That sounds like, oh, boo, you're taking all the
No,
woo out
but
of
no, look, you
it.
might
But
be right. You
yeah,
might totally
yeah,
be right. And I think that this is important here. The fact that I believe in a category that we laughingly call woo doesn't mean that all manifestations of woo are actually real. I
right.
mean, there's a guy I know, I'm not going to mention his name. He's a well-known evangelical apologist and speaker. And I remember we were walking, when I was first getting to know him, he wasn't well known at the time. We were just two dudes walking around the city. And he was like, "Well, God told me this. God told me that." I'm like, "How do you know God told you that?" "Well, God did."
Good question.
And I
That's
went
circular,
home.
man. It's Like,
I know, and he lived by this. He would like always listen to God and doing what God told him to do, but there was no rhyme or reason to his life, and I could see that he was doing things that I thought were fairly destructive. And I went home and said to my wife, I said, I don't understand why this guy is this way. And she had grown up in evangelicalism in Texas, and she said, well, there's a part of evangelicalism where people really do believe this and they don't test it at all. They just go with the feeling. And I'm like, that's really dangerous. I believe God does speak to us, but we have to test it with scripture and with what we know from authoritative tradition, et cetera.
yeah, and can I also add, because this intersects with, Lerman's research and like the vineyard people who, well, if I get a word from the Lord, then right, I subject it to these tests. But part of the problem is, depending on what you're hoping to hear from the Lord about, it's not easy to go and test it against scripture. Like if I have some very specific question specific to my life circumstances where I'd really like to get some guidance from God about it, I'm not going to be able to go find chapter and verse, um, telling me if this really came from God or it didn't, because maybe it's something where I have like two or three perfectly legitimate life paths or choices in front of me, and I'm just trying to discern what the best one is.
Mhm.
So, and I feel like in those kinds of cases, I don't know that you actually can know if God is talking to you. I think you just have to, you know, go with your best judgment and the judgment of your family and friends and pray that God blesses it. And who knows, maybe God is looking down. I'm sure this has happened. Well, I know this has happened to me throughout my life. I know God has looked down and gone, nuts. Why does she have to go and do that?
Okay.
Okay, well, fine. I'll bring something good out of it anyway. But gee,
I have a
thanks.
story about that,
Yeah.
a woo story. Um, Back in 1993, I was working in Washington, and my younger sister had her first baby. She and her husband had a baby, and I felt really far from family. And I quit my very good job in DC and moved back to this tiny town, hoping to reconnect with my family. And I'd been there about 6 weeks, and I realized, boy, did I make a mistake,
Yeah.
because my dad will never accept me. I had to. He was very controlling, but anyway, so I'm like, okay, Lord, I remember having a big argument with my dad and then going to church. And I was up all night at a coffee shop. I went to church as soon as it opened the next morning, said, Lord, I've seen what I need to see. Get me out of here. And I don't want it to be a really long story, but I ended up going overseas after Christmas to visit a friend in Norway. And I began to have some very powerful, intensely symbolic dreams, and like I'd never had before. And they were very Christian. And I wrote to a friend I knew in Washington, an older Christian who was very discerning. And I said, look, I'll be back in Louisiana by the time you get this. Write me there and tell me what you think. When I got home to Louisiana, there were two letters. There was one from him interpreting my dreams, and his interpretation was, the Lord is telling you through these dreams that you need to go back to Washington. Your family will never understand you, and that's okay, but your calling is to go to Washington. The other letter was a letter from the Washington Times where I had worked, offering me my job back. And I thought, wow, here it is. Now you would
Synchronicity. Yeah. Yep.
well, you would think that, okay, go, because it made sense, but I couldn't do that. Then I got immediately involved in writing a freelance story for the Baton Rouge newspaper that ended up saving a little Black Baptist church that was threatened. My parents were so moved by that. They said, we've seen what you can do with your journalism. Go back with our blessing. But I was still waiting for a sign. Like, no, Lord, you've got to give me a sign. So we get to, I know. I get to Friday afternoon. It was the day I had to decide to accept or turn the job down. I was living in those days in a big plantation house, not like a fancy Gone with the Wind house, but an old antebellum house. I was house sitting for a friend. And I had another friend, a woman named Kim, coming up from Baton Rouge for the weekend. She and her husband were getting a divorce, and she was broken about it. I said, come up to spend some time. We'll talk. She wasn't a Christian, but I wanted to talk to her about the Lord. And anyway, we're talking that Friday afternoon. I said, oh, Kim, I've got to make a phone call to Washington. I don't know if I'm going to accept this job or not, but I've got to call them. So she went outside to walk around while I made the call. So I prayed and said, I'm just going to take a leap of faith. I called, accepted the job, and I hung the phone up and went into a bedroom, shut the door, and prayed to the Lord, thanking him for his help. And I Catholic, then I thank the Virgin Mary for her prayers for me. I was praying the rosary. Suddenly, the room filled with sunlight. This was an overcast January day, but the room filled with sunlight and the powerful aroma of roses. Now, in the Catholic imaginary, that's a sign that Mary is present. And I was like breathing, what's this? What's this? Mind you, this is January, the dead of winter. There are no flowers anywhere. It lasted for 10 of those rosary beads. And then the clouds came back, the roses went away. And I was so shocked. And I said, this is a sign, but I already made the decision. And then I'd prayed also, Mary, please hold Kim's hand and take her to the Lord. Show her the Lord. She's hurting. I was just dazed. And I went upstairs and started making up a bed. I heard Kim come in from downstairs. She comes up the stairs and her eyes are big. She's holding her right hand out and said, smell my hand. I smelled it. It smelled powerfully of roses. I said, did you wash it with floral soap? No. Perfume? No. I was coming up the stairs. I heard you upstairs cleaning up and I rubbed my nose. My hand smells like roses. I told her what I'd prayed for her, and then the aroma went away like that. So I took the job. I had taken the job and I went back, but I interpreted that as like the Lord saying, all right, you've got your sign, but you made the choice based on your faith and on reason, what reason told you. You don't have to have signs. An immature Christian needs signs. And that lesson has stayed with me all my life. The Lord sent me a sign, no doubt about it, something that cannot be explained. And it was witnessed by someone who wasn't even a believer, and it happened to her too. But I think that normally we don't need that. God helps us in ways that are not so explicit.
Yeah, and I mentioned in my review, I mentioned so Andrew Klavan's book. I love his book, The Great Good Thing.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And he talks about these moments of epiphany through this very long conversion. I tried once to see if I could write a movie treatment to adapt it into a film, and I struggled with it because it doesn't follow the typical beats of a movie conversion, right? It's a messy, windy conversion story. But my favorite moment in that book is when he talks about almost committing suicide and listening to this baseball game on the radio. Um, and then he hears his favorite baseball player is talking about after the game, and this player had really bad, painful knees. And he's asked, so, what do you think about this win? And he comments, how did you do it? And the guy was a Christian. And at that moment, Andrew said, he could have said some canned Christian-y thing, and that was not what I would have wanted to hear. If I'd heard that, I would have turned the radio off because it wasn't going to reach me in that moment. But instead, all that this guy said was, sometimes you just have to play in pain. And Andrew's like, that was God speaking to me. Like, and he'll
Mm-hmm.
get emotional, well up with tears when he tells this story. It's like the humility of God in that moment to reach me in that way when I was at my weakest and my darkest, just that simple reminder to play in pain. And it could have beat me over the head with it, but instead it was just this gentle, tough word. And I often think about, what does it mean that God speaks to us through?
Mm-hmm.
Through people, through nature, through these things. What does that mean? Is it like a direct divine action, if what we think about, like God speaks and something happens? Or is it subtler and more complicated than that? Is it more that baseball player was the kind of man to have that, or the people you meet, like that woman, that cleaning lady, Angela, who was so kind to you, the Palestinian woman.
Oh yeah.
Was it just that she was such a good and godly woman that in
This
that,
is what she gave me, by the way.
yeah,
I'm
there you
still
go.
wearing
It's
it.
beautiful. You're wearing that cross. So is it just that her heart had been prepared all her life in humbly serving God, that when she saw you, her first thought was to give you this gift and be kind to you. That could have been without like a specific supernatural nudge in that moment. And yet I think you could still say, just like Andrew says about the guy on the radio, this was of God. This was
Yeah,
a work of the Lord.
I completely agree with that. And I think that yeah, I think the answer is yes. It can be both extraordinary and ordinary, but it's
Yeah.
still God acting. It's like, look, the Chartres Cathedral gets, I think, 2 million visitors every year. Very few of them are going to have an epiphany like I did that lead them to Christ. But it happened to me, and I can't say, well, because it's so rare, it didn't happen. And God gave me a choice. I could have walked out of there like that was interesting. Recently, Bethel, I went to Rocamadour, which is a tiny cliffside village in the south of France, way off the beaten
Was that the
track.
Welbeck with the
Yes.
yes, okay. Yep. Yeah.
Okay. And I'll tell this to our listeners. In Michel Houellebecq's novel Submission, 2015, the main character, Francoise, is dissolute professor at the Sorbonne. France is going Muslim. Things are changing, and he's offered an opportunity. If you convert to Islam, you don't even have to be sincere, the government says. Just make the formal conversion. We'll guarantee you a job, and you'll get 3 wives. And he's lonely, and he's thinking about it because he knows it'll be corrupt, but he's thinking about it. He ends up going on vacation to the south of France, and he meets somebody at the campsite who says, "You need to go to Rocamadour." It was a pilgrimage site in the Middle Ages, a great pilgrimage site. Yet kings went there to pray. He said, "You'll really see the power of medieval Christianity." So Francois goes there, as I did 2 weeks ago, into the little chapel, and he sees pilgrims there. And as they're praying and singing, he himself, Francois, begins to have a mystical experience. Then he catches himself and says, "Oh, no, it must have been something I ate." He walks out, goes back to Paris, converts to Islam, and it's his spiritual death, basically. And Welbeck, not a believer, wants you to understand it that way. And there's a reason that I tell the story in Living in Wonder about the man. It's a story about Tobias Wolff, the American novelist, who he didn't tell me this story, but I got it from a book John Cornwell wrote. He told John Cornwell about how he had been sort of a nominal Catholic, but Catholic enough in his 20s to go to Lourdes, the place where people go for healing, just to volunteer one summer. His job was to take people who were unable to go into the waters at the miraculous spring and take the waters. He would carry them in there and carry them out. Well, he tells a story about how he had really bad eyesight then, but he was too vain as a young man to wear glasses. Well, he ended up taking this small Italian girl who was a quadriplegic. He took her into the water. He accompanied her back to the tarmac, to the airport where she was going to fly back on this chartered flight. And he was just sobbing over her suffering. And he was trying to keep the flies off of her. It was August. She was sweating, and the plane door shut without her. The other patients had gotten on, but not her. And he goes and runs and starts banging on the door, saying, "Open it, open it. You've forgotten her." And he said he was crying because of the pathos of this poor girl. They opened the door. She got on. Off she goes. On the bus back to his dorm at Lourdes, he realizes, I could see. He could see perfectly. He had received some miraculous healing. His tears of mercy for this child, the Lord had used it somehow to heal him. So he said he felt this overwhelming urge. I just have to go to the grotto at Lourdes and say thank you. But he doesn't go. He meets a friend of his, and they never start drinking beer. They never gets around to going to pray. Next morning, he wakes up, and his eyesight is back to where it once was. Mm-hmm. Now, Wolff, many years later, reflecting on that, said, "The truth is, I didn't want that miracle. Of course, I wanted to see clearly. But I knew that if I accepted it, I would have to change my life. I'd have to give my life to God." And he didn't want to do that. And I think that's such a profound story, because that's the fictional story that Francois in the Welbeck novel goes through. And I think in my own walk towards Christ, the main reason I stayed away from him for so long was because I didn't want to surrender my will. I believed in God, but I wanted to bargain with him so I could maintain enough control of my life to where my life would be easy. But that's not how God works. That's not how Christ works.
Gosh, so many thoughts. One interesting story you tell about the novelist Graham Greene, and he and his mistress, like they go to this Padre Pio mass, but they're like,
Yeah.
I don't want to meet. Now, me personally, I'm not quite sure if I believe everything about Padre Pio, but it doesn't matter because what Graham Greene says in that moment is very interesting along the lines of what you're saying. He's like, I don't know if I didn't want to meet Padre Pio because I didn't want my life to be changed. Now, 2 years after that meeting, you don't mention this in the book, but 2 years after that, Graham Greene wrote his novel, The End of the Affair, which is an excellent novel to read in this whole enchantment context and in a Catholic context specifically, because that novel is very much about mid 20th century disenchanted Britain, right? And there's an atheist figure who sounds kind of like one of the new atheists, and he's on his soapbox, and there is no blah, 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 everything, yada, yada. Um, But what happens suddenly at the very end of the novel is like this torrent of enchantment and just like crazy miraculous stuff suddenly starts to happen. And but it's all very much bound up with this main character's sin that he doesn't want to let go of this affair that he's having. Um, and so isn't that interesting how so often these things are bound up with sin, right? And like a not wanting to let something go. Um, I do also want to throw in a cautionary note though, because um, I mean that story about Tobias Wolff is very interesting, and maybe he's right that like okay, this was like kind of a judgment for my doubt, my not wanting the miracle. But I do want to really be careful to not like I wouldn't want Christians to get false hope, like Christians who have chronic illness or chronic pain, um, to worry, oh no, like I didn't take this opportunity that opened up or this chance to go on a pilgrimage or go to a healing service or do this kind of thing. Um, Maybe if I wonder if I had done that, would God have healed me? And did I just like miss my boat, so to speak? And am I now kind of like being punished for not choosing
No,
to
no,
that
you're
first
right. You're right.
opportunity?
No, people
Yeah,
shouldn't
yeah.
think that. And in fact, I go back to what Clavin said. That's such an important point because I
Playing in
remember
pain.
that
Yeah.
what's that?
The
Clavin,
playing in
yeah,
pain. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, playing in pain because um 2018, I was here in Paris and I was having coffee with a famous French philosopher and who is just in great despair over the collapse of France, the Islamization of France. And we were both talking about Welbeck and how we think Welbeck is prophetic. And finally, I said to him, Professor, where do you find hope? And he just looked at me with the saddest eyes and he said, I have no hope. I
Mm,
said, I do have hope. My hope is in Jesus Christ. But please don't think that I'm saying that to you like some shallow TV evangelist. I
yeah.
think that things are going to get really much darker before the light comes. But my hope as a Christian is not the same as optimism. It is the sure conviction that however much we have to suffer, that if we unite our suffering to Christ and suffer well, that the Lord will redeem it and that it will work to the greater good. And he listened to me. This man is one of the top philosophers in France. He said, well, that's good for you Americans, but here in France, we don't believe in God. And I
Now, how's that
realized,
for fatalism, man?
yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah, yeah. And this poor
yeah.
man, I brought him up at dinner tonight in Paris with some Christians, and and they said that's it. These people, they closed their minds because he couldn't even. I wasn't going to convert him on the spot there, but it made me realize that yeah, if I didn't believe in God, if I didn't think suffering had ultimate meaning, a meaning that we may not understand in this world, then I'd want to kill myself if I was watching everything I believed in, as this man does, the values of the republic and democracy and humanism and all that, watching it fall apart. There's no reason to go on. And
Well,
this, by the way,
yeah.
is the main lesson I got from talking to the Christians who stayed behind in the Iron Curtain and who fought the good fight.
Hmm.
None of them, not a single one, expected to live to see the end of communism. They resisted because they believed it was the right thing to do and because they believed that God saw them
Yeah.
and that the Lord would reward them, maybe not in this life, but in the next, for holding on to the faith, no matter how much they had to suffer.
Right. What you're describing, it reminds me of my conversation with Douglas Murray, which is going on now, what, six years ago? Gosh, it's been a while. But this really lovely chat that Justin Brierley set up with me and Douglas. I actually wasn't out under my real name yet at that point, so it was kind of funny. Um, but I sensed a similar kind of, yeah, this deep civilizational weariness. Douglas is sort of like a British version of a Welbeck character. In fact, he even refers to that very scene in Submission when Francois is trying to be enchanted and then he like goes away and it doesn't end up working. Um, and at one point in our conversation, Justin kind of did his gentle, evangelistic thing. It's like, and what would it take for you, Douglas, to, it's that lovely accent he has, very polite, tea drinking British evangelism. What would it take for you, to re-examine your faith or whatever? And Douglas said, I think I would need to hear a voice. And Justin's like, oh, oh, really? Okay. And like we're both trying to kind of, because neither of us expected him to say that. I don't know quite what we expected him to say, but not that. Um, and Douglas is like, yeah, I mean, like for me personally, I'm not saying that that should be other people's bar, but that's kind of where it's at for me. It would have to be some kind of a breaking through. It would have to be an enchantment, right? Like a re-enchanting moment of like God speaking to me, God addressing me in the here and now. And I said something or other, but if I had been like quicker on my feet or more clever, I would have asked Douglas what he wanted the voice to say. Like if God spoke to us, would we really want that? Would we really appreciate what he said? Maybe be careful what you wish for, I guess I might say.
Well, I can tell you that my own late father, who died in 2015, we had a similar situation at his house after his father died. It was I've told the story in my book, and it's a long story, not worth telling. But I love telling stories because it makes these things concrete. After his father died, I was there with him. I was down from Washington out for the funeral. He had poltergeist activity in the house around him, and it was all centered on him. And my father was such a foursquare, realistic guy. He said he believed in God, but he was like, he just wasn't that pious. And I ended up calling in. He was so unnerved by it all. I called an exorcist I knew because I was a new Catholic then. And things happened. And there was a woman there, a Cajun grandmother, who had a real spiritual gift of discernment. And not knowing anything about my dad's history, because his father had died having betrayed my dad in a horrible way. And my dad remained faithful to his father, even though he had been betrayed because he was the only living child he had. And the Cajun lady whispered to the priest, and the priest said, "It's your father, and he can't move on until you get him forgiveness." And that just my dad's eyes bugged out. I said, "Dad, tell him the story." And he told the story. And the priest said, "Do you forgive your father?" My dad said, "I do." The priest blessed the house and said, "You won't have any more trouble here." And they didn't. Now, my father, all the rest of his life, he testified that really happened. I said, "Dad, you've seen the power of forgiveness here. Let this change your life." Well, 5 years later, he was having a bad fight with his nephew, my cousin, and the cousin was wrong. And he came to my dad and apologized and said, "Please forgive me, Uncle Ray." And my dad called and told me about it. I said, "Daddy, that's wonderful. You forgave him, right?" "Well, no, I didn't forgive him." Like, wait, Daddy. And I reminded him of what had happened and how, the Lord had freed him. For some reason, mysterious reason, his forgiveness freed. And my dad said, "Well, I'll forgive him, but I won't forget." I couldn't believe this from my dad, but for him, the idea of maintaining control, the narrative of control was more important there, even though he said that he testified all of his life that this had happened and he had received something like a miracle. Now, it went on, my dad's posture of prideful unforgiveness ended up destroying my entire family.
Mhm.
And my divorce, in fact, my wife filed for divorce. It all ultimately came from the fact that when we moved back to Louisiana with my wife and kids in 2011, after my sister died, they wouldn't accept us because we weren't like them in every way. And this was such a shock, but my dad could not or would not let go.
Mhm.
Now, ultimately, he apologized to me shortly before he died, and I forgave him. And, I think he's with the Lord now. Nevertheless, this has been a powerful lesson to me watching his life and the things that happened in his life about the power of forgiveness in the spiritual realm to loose those who were not only to help us in this life, but also to help those in the other life. Now, you might have a thousand theological objections to this. I don't really know what the deal was with my grandfather theologically, but I do know that I witnessed the poltergeist, the banging on the windows, the things moving around the house, and I witnessed the priest, and I saw it all. And I believe that in some mysterious way, my father forgiving his father allowed him to move on into the afterlife. The point is simply this, that even my dad acknowledging that this had happened and that it meant something. It meant that forgiveness is powerful. He still couldn't allow it to change his life because it would have meant having to the world didn't work the way he thought it did, and he couldn't live with that.
Yep.
I one of the things that I often remind people is that when you read the New Testament, nobody saw more miracles than Peter.
Yeah.
And sitting outside that fire,
Yeah.
when a slave girl says, "Hey, don't I hear some Galilean in your accent? Weren't you one of the
Couldn't be
guys I
me.
saw with
Yeah.
him?" He folds in a minute.
Yeah.
And I think a consistent theme in scripture, and this is, I think, really something as we see, I think, this modern frame sort of recede. As a pastor, I know the story you just told, Rod. These are not uncommon stories within families. They will tell them to their pastors. They will tell them, they won't let them go out in public because they don't want people to think they're crazy. Modernity sort of put a heavy blanket on the culture where these things sort of would be whispered about, but they're not at all uncommon to have people have interesting and strange stories that it's really difficult to categorize. And so most often as a pastor, you just listen to them and you don't try to map it, or you just listen to it and let it go by. Because and I also always point to the story of Paul, because at the stoning of Stephen in Acts, Stephen says, "I see the heavens open, and there's Christ." And that Saul is sitting right there. And you'd think the families of the people that Saul persecuted might say, "Well, Lord, while you had the gates open, could you look down and just glance to the side a little and say to that guy from Tarsus, 'Hey, look up a little bit and see'?" But he doesn't. He waits and he waits. And then there's the road to Damascus. And it's like the Lord knew, "Saul, you need to dig your hole deeper." And for me, as we watch this, as we watch our filters change, as we watch the culture turn, we should we should remember that Christianity has lived in this world far longer without modernity than it lived with modernity. And so just imagining that once people recognize that strange things happen, then suddenly they'll say, "Oh, I believe in God and I'll do what he says." No, the apostles watched Jesus do how many miracles? And observing miracles alone does not necessarily produce faith. And that faith itself is something of a miracle, and very much something of a mystery. And why it seems to land here and not there, why it seems to land now and not then, none of us can map and none of us can answer. So I'm the Calvinist among us, and for Calvinists, we just simply say, well, that's what God does. But what's also interesting to me in this moment now, if we sort of turn towards the church and how we see this is going to impact kind of these siloed traditions that had sort of grown up geographically. I have this rather awkward word, metagelical, that I think we are in fact entering a very metagelical period where now via the internet, in some ways, well, orthodoxy is in America, and we're discovering new and interesting things about orthodoxy, and Catholicism is there, and you've got Pentecostals and how many different kinds of Protestants, and how God is going to work with his church between these traditions, and how these traditions are all going to um, learn from each other, grow with each other, hopefully learn to work with one another and regard one another. I think we're living in a very interesting and I think hopeful time that maybe we can stop. And Rod, I really look at you in that, because you've sort of covered the map now in your not that long life. You've been a nominal Methodist, you've been a devout Catholic, and now you're a devout Orthodox. And I don't take umbrage um, with you declaring the glories and perhaps some of the uniquenesses of this tradition that you found and this tradition that has embraced you. Just like I don't take umbrage with someone telling me that they married the best woman at the school. All right.
Well, I believe, and this is one big shift that happened to me in my life, and it all came because the Lord crushed me in my intellectual pride. I believe that if any of us are saved, we're saved through Jesus Christ, through a personal encounter with him, not by necessarily affirming all the correct doctrines. I think doctrine is there and dogma for a reason, to give us the path and to keep us on the right path. But I will not be surprised if in God's mercy I make it to heaven, if I see righteous Mormons there or righteous Muslims there. That is no reason to be indifferent to the way. I believe that if they make it there, they will have made it there in spite of their theological errors. But ultimately, it is the saving encounter with Jesus Christ. Now, I don't say that to say that all the rest of what, like the Orthodox Church or the Presbyterian Church, or that it doesn't matter. It does matter, but it's just this reorientation. Like I met a guy, a Canadian, on getting ready to go on the pilgrimage to Chartres. And I said, a 25-year-old guy, I said, so why are you here? He said, well, I really want to go on a pilgrimage. You can go on all these different pilgrimages, but they're really like tourism. But, this pilgrimage, every step we take and everything we encounter on the way, when we get to Chartres, it's all pointing to God. It's not an end in and of itself, but it's there to draw us closer to what Orthodox would call theosis, to be deeply transformed by the Holy Spirit. And that's how I see things. And, it was so interesting to me to see these young people, teenagers, people in their 20s, making this leap. It's extremely countercultural here in France, where like half the people are atheists. It's one of the most atheist countries in the world. They don't care anymore about respectability. They just want to be faithful Christians. And when I was over here in 2018, promoting the Benedict option, the French version of the Benedict option, I noticed that everybody I talked to was Catholic, and the Catholics who were my age, I was in, this was in my early 50s then. My age and older, they had real problems with the book. But those who were younger, like 40 and younger, they had no problems at all. And I think I figured it out. The older Catholics still wanted to believe that the faith had an active role to play in broader French society. And if they just tweaked this and learned how to talk about their faith in a different way, then everything could be okay. These younger Catholics grew up in a thoroughly de-Christianized society. They're like, yeah, we don't care about that. We just want to be faithful. We want to figure out ways we can live more faithful lives. And I think that's what's driving these young people, that so many of them told me a version of the same story, that we live in a world where there is no meaning anymore. There's no path through life. And we want truth. We want stability. We want purpose. And they want community. And they found it on that pilgrimage. There's a guy I read, and you guys might know him, Zygmunt Bauman. He's dead now, but he was a Marxist sociologist. He's a guy who came up with the term liquid modernity. And he said, in ages past, people, whether you were religious or not, you experienced life as like a pilgrimage, meaning that everybody was going in the same basic direction, all going together. You pass the familiar landmarks, ending at the same destination, which is death. Now, though, people experience life like not as pilgrims, but as tourists, meaning there's no set path. You choose your own path. You move on according to your desires. You're basically trying to escape boredom. And but that's no way to live. I mean, Saint Benedict, in his rule from the 6th century, said the worst kind of monk is what he called a gyrovague, who flits from monastery to monastery, taking what he can and then moving on, because you cannot grow spiritually if that's how you live. Well, all these kids on this pilgrimage, they've come out of a world where, because of our economy, the way a globalist economy works, and all the structures of the world have broken down. There's nobody to tell them, here is the way to live. And they're going back to a traditional form of faith that can give them that sense of structure and deep meaning that they're longing for. Interestingly enough, so many of them told me that they discovered this path during COVID, because they were stuck in their houses and they got online. I just wrote a piece for the Free Press about how some young men in America became radicalized to the far right from watching, anti-Semites and radicals online. These kids got radicalized for Christ online. And so it's a scary time, but also, as you say, Paul, a hopeful time, because people are now able to hear messages that they wouldn't have been able to hear before, because for whatever reason, they had pushed it aside, like me at 17, thinking Christianity was nothing but bourgeois conformity or crazy TV evangelists. There's way more to the story than that.
Yeah. We've got 15 minutes, so I don't know, Rod, because I just got back from Synod, and so often if I get busy, I'm just thinking like one thing ahead of me. But we have this conference in Chicago, and we're going to have Peugeot, we're going to have Vervaeke, I'll be there, you'll be there, Elizabeth Oldfield, you had a conversation with her, Bethel will be there, Kel will be there. What do you want from this conference? Why did you say yes? What are you hoping for? Then I'll have Bethel, you answer the same question.
Well, I love these conversations. The people you're having there are people I either know and have been in conversation with, ongoing conversation with, or people I've wanted to know. And I don't think any of us has the answer, but we're all trying to find a way forward in this extraordinary cultural moment, and not only find a way forward, the true path forward out of the dark wood of postmodernity, but to keep from going down false paths. And I'm always learning. And like Vervaeke, I've only seen him, like you talking to him on your show, and Jonathan talking to him. I really want to know more about this guy. And I always find that when I go there and meet and meet people like this, and even get together with old friends, things happen. You talk to people about their story, you tell them your story, you hear their story, and all of these things are good for the making of my own perspective, to help, I think, ultimately draw me closer to truth and to the author of all truth, which is our Lord.
What do you think, Bethel? Why are you going to be there?
I just want to see my friends. But yeah, I've never met Vervaeke before. Of course, I never met Ms. Oldfield because she's over on the other side of the ocean. So to some extent, I'll be your resident modernist gadfly there to kind of raise my hand and ask awkward questions like, that wasn't what Descartes actually thought. Anyway, I'll try not to be too annoying. In
It's
the
not just Descartes, it's William of Ockham is the big villain, but carry on.
Anyway, so yes, I plan to come and be as annoying as possible in that sense. But no, I like there's several people. So yeah, Unitarian Sam, of course, our old friend, my good friend Jeff, who's not very online, but you know who you are, Jeff. If you're watching this, love you, Jeff. And he's gonna be my chauffeur in bed and breakfast while I'm there, old family friend. So yeah, I just kind of like with ARC, it was the people, it was the in between conversations. It's the what happens over meals and the sharing back and forth. And there's also a couple people I've only quote unquote known through Twitter who I think I'm going to meet for the first time there. So that's always exciting. I love to incarnate friendships like that because I think the internet has redefined friendship in some unhealthy ways maybe. And so I always like meeting people face to
All right.
face in the flesh.
Well,
Um, yeah.
you guys answered quickly. I got a clickbait
no,
question for you. Go ahead, Rod.
I want to throw something in there. I had lunch with today in Paris with a French friend who had invited Jonathan Pajot over for 10 days recently and had hosted him here. This guy's a believing Catholic and really loves Pajot's stuff. And he was telling me that Pajot had real trouble getting through to French speakers and to the people in France. And my friend Pierre is his name. Pierre said, I think the big difference, and Pajot has talked about this to me privately, that his francophone listeners really he's so frustrated with them because they don't get what he's talking about. And I asked Pierre, why do you think this is? And he said, to be honest, I think it's because we in the French speaking world never had a Jordan Peterson moment. He said, I believe that Peterson was like the one that a lot of people turned to when new atheism was burning out. And Peterson, though not a believer, he helped people understand religion and Christianity in fresh ways. He was the bridge. We don't know him in France. And he said, I think that really has cost us. Now, I bring that up because that's why it's so important we Anglophones, we have this thing. We have a conference where we can see Jonathan and hear him, and with Vervaeke and all the others who are going to be there. There's so much ferment going on in the Anglosphere, and we need to take advantage of it, make use of it, let it help us grow. Because I'm telling you, my books are translated into French, into European languages. Europeans come up to me all the time, like, I read your book, and man, nobody's writing this stuff over here. And I'm like, well, glory to God, I'm glad I could help you. But I try to, I'm helping people over here discover people like Pajot and others whom they normally wouldn't see because they're behind a wall of language.
Yep. Yep. So my clickbait question: what's going to happen to Jordan Peterson? Now, Jordan, my read on Jordan, I followed Jordan closely, as has Bethel. I think you, Rod, you directed me to him. Jordan's right now a little bit stuck. And I know all the Christians are going to say Jordan is stuck because Jordan basically hasn't bent the knee. He's not submitted his will. He's not. But Jordan has had a way of, he is a lightning rod stuff. I mean, even just with that 20 people surrounding Jordan video that happened, Jordan just has a way of being someplace and something happens. So what do you think's going to come of Jordan in the next 5 years? He's just going to sort of recede from the conversation? Is something else going to happen? What do you think?
Wait, can I go first?
Sure.
Well, I mean, first, I guess I sort of indirectly owe my career to Jordan Peterson, I guess, because I think it was, I mean, I'd done like bits of freelance writing here and there. But when he came on the scene, I started writing about him when there weren't a whole lot of Christians paying attention to him. So then my work kind of got shared around, and then I reviewed his debates with Sam Harris, and that kind of went viral, and things sort of snowballed from there. So I'm sure he's not watching this conversation, but Jordan, if you're out there, thank you. I probably wouldn't have my career today if it wasn't for you. Um, but I mean, the thing is that I think, and Paul, you've said this many times, Jordan's never, he's not saying any new stuff that he hasn't been saying for years and years and years, even, go all the way back to Mats of Meaning, which is, yeah, end of the 90s. It's pretty much the same stuff in there. And so I, yeah, there's probably some stubbornnness there. I guess I might take a sort of the easy Christian answer there, but I also think he's genuinely intellectually confused. And always has been. I think Peterson's great frustration is that he's desperately trying to jam certain puzzle pieces into the picture that don't fit, that never fit. And he's trying to kind of like put contradictory things together. All like you've got Darwin in there, you've got Jung, you've got William James and the pragmatists, and like all these, this weird academic cocktail. And this is his training, this is what he was handed. And he's earnestly, I don't think he's faking anything, he's earnestly trying to make sense of it all. And I just kind of want to tell him, Jordan, this intrinsically is not going to make sense. This is a lost cause. Finishing this puzzle is a lost cause. But it's just impossible to tear him away from that jigsaw puzzle. So I think he will probably recede over time. I think he's just getting tired, like physically. And so I kind of want him to recede in a way, like for his own good, it's because it's just I don't want him to burn himself out. So like my hope is that he can figure out an off ramp, like figure out some kind of institution or something to set up that's in good hands, that like he can trust, okay, if I step away, this isn't gonna like go haywire or whatever, and figure out, okay, who are the younger people who can help to steward the legacy, as it were, so to speak.
All right.
Well, like everybody else, or every other Christian anyway, I hope he does convert, because I think his heart and his mind will continue to be restless until it rests in God.
Amen. That's what I've said as well. Yeah.
And I, like you, but I wouldn't have put it quite this way, but I think you're right, Bethel. I wish he would step back for his own good, because he stretched way too thin.
Yeah.
I think he took a profoundly wrong turn when he reimagined himself as a political pundit.
He's not a political pundit. I know.
No, he's not.
Yeah.
No, but I think this is what happens when people start treating you like a guru. You live into that, and I think his métier was in talking about psychology and human nature and things like that. And I think that's what he's best at. And I wish he would return to that. I do think you're on to something too, Bethel, when you said that he's trying so hard to put this into a framework. He's deeply intellectual. But listening to you talk about him in this way, I was thinking of the guy I quote in my book, the German sociologist. Forget his name escapes me now, but he was talking about the sense of resonance. That's
Hartmut
his word
Rosa.
for, yeah, Hartmut Rosa. That's his word for enchantment, I think, close enough. And he says that we can only feel this sense of resonance, a sense of wholeness and connection when we keep a certain distance from the things that we find enchanting. He said that, if you have no connection with anything else, then there can be no relationship there. But like when you fall in love with somebody, there is a relationship established there, but in that space, that interstice between you and the object of your enchantment or of your love, it has to exist in a mysterious, undefinable way. But when you try to move closer to it to control it, it loses all of its resonance. It loses its ability to enchant you. And I think that Jordan, insofar as he keeps trying to come up with a grand system that will explain it all, it's always going to elude him. And I think this is a problem a lot of intellectuals have. And this in a very primitive way, this was my problem too. When I thought I was faithful to God because I was working out all the intellectual, the doctrinal stuff, which is important, but it's not the main thing. The doctrine was pointing me to that true encounter of the heart with the Lord. And I'm not talking about just feelings. I mean, Thomas Aquinas, his famous story about the end of his life, where this is a man who was one of the greatest systematic theologians ever to live. Then he had this mystical vision saying Mass one day near the end of his life. And he said, everything I've written is like straw. Now, I don't think everything Thomas Aquinas wrote is of straw. It's some of the most incredible products ever of the human mind. But I think this was the Lord showing him, the hierarchy of being, that ultimately what matters is the deep encounter, life-changing encounter with Christ in a
Yeah.
mystical way. Now, most of us are not gonna, very few of us are gonna have that in life, where if God grants us that, well, glory to God, but most of us that will not happen to us until the afterlife. But that's what we're all pointing towards. And I hope Jordan can just surrender trying to make it all work, and realize that life is less a problem to be solved and more a mystery to be lived.
All right.
If I can get like a few closing thoughts, kind of like
All right.
wrap this all up.
Close some thoughts.
Go
Okay,
ahead,
I'll do
Bethel.
like the Douglas Murray thing where he just delivers the perfect closing speech. It's like, thank you so much, Douglas. I'm not Douglas, but I can pretend. So I think my mom has this great phrase, which I don't know that it was original to her, but I think, Rod, you talk about what does the church need? What do we need? What we need to recover. So I think we need to connect the prose and the passion is what we need to do. So we desperately need that the revival of enchantment in the sense of awakening ourselves to beauty, to that aesthetic arrest. Such a great phrase by Martin Shaw. I love that. It's like you see something beautiful and you don't have a choice, man. Like God has put you under arrest. We need to teach young people so that they can be men with chests, like C.S. Lewis writes about, so that they can look at the waterfall and recognize, oh, the waterfall is beautiful in and of itself, and it's something I can't control, to your point about control. But at the end of the day, feeling it can be transient. It can fade. You can have dark nights of the soul where life doesn't feel very enchanting. God doesn't feel very close. And so I do think it is then also important in those moments to have the kinds of reasons that they might have seemed sort of dry and dusty in a certain light, but when you come back to it, you're really grateful to be like, oh wow, I read the Gospels and I have all of these independent reasons to know that I'm actually reading words Jesus said, comforting words Jesus actually said to his disciples, that this has been faithfully preserved and handed down to me so that I could read this in my time of trial, my time of darkness. Um, So I think, and that's something my mom certainly has taken great comfort in her journey with chronic pain, is having that even when God does not seem close. So we need both. I think we need prose and the
Mhm.
passion, and if we can connect those in the right way, then that will give us what we need to to face whatever comes, which we don't know
Well,
what it will be, but yeah.
yeah, I can agree with that. And there's a great film that talks about this called To the Wonder. It's a Terrence Malick film that almost nobody understood when it came out, like in 2013. But a Christian, especially one who knows anything about medieval symbolism, will get. It's a film about two sets of characters whose lives intersect. Ben Affleck and a French actress, Olga somebody. They play a couple who fall in love. Have you seen the film, Bethel?
No, I need to look it up now. Yeah, you
Wow.
always have
It's
great film
so
rights.
they play they're a couple who fall in love at Mont Saint-Michel. The film opens with them at Mont Saint-Michel in France. And then, they fall in love. She's got a little girl. They move to America, to Oklahoma, back where he's from. But then their marriage falls apart because they haven't grounded it in any kind of practice or higher commitment. He hasn't asked her to marry. He just says, "Come to America with me." The other character who intersects with their life is a Catholic priest, and he's serving in the town. He had an initial experience of wonder that allowed him to, or led him to commit his life to Christ as a priest. But the wonder has gone away, and he's going through a very dark night of the soul. And you can see he's suffering, but he continues to say mass, to hear confession, to minister to the poor and the sick, and all of these things. And you see the contrast between the two. His life stays on track because he remembers the wonder, the experience of wonder, and has built a life for himself based on that experience, following the traditions and following his commitment. Whereas Ben Affleck and his girlfriend, they're all over the map because there's nothing to bind them to take that primal experience of falling in love and the wonder of love to bind it to something to help them go through the dark night of their soul. And I
Mhm.
think there's a really powerful lesson there for us Christians. And final point, I know we're past midnight in Paris here. When I talked to this young American priest, 32-year-old guy. He wouldn't let me use his name because he didn't have permission to talk to a journalist. But he was there at Chartres, escorting a group of American Catholic high school boys. And he said, it's been amazing. We went before we came to the pilgrimage, we spent some time at a traditionalist monastery in the south of France. And this was the first time any of these boys had ever seen something truly beautiful. They were waking up at 4 a.m, hearing these monks do these ancient Gregorian chants, and it really was making an impression on them. And the priest went on to say, I think that we might overdo catechesis, and teaching them the doctrine and things like that. These things are important. But he said, I'm realizing that these boys, most American high school boys, will have seen so much real ugliness, pornography, he's talking about mostly, before they've seen anything truly beautiful. He said, I'm getting the sense that what we need to start doing as we're forming these young Christians is expose them to more beauty, Christian music, like beautiful music, beautiful architecture. So he said, because when they respond to beauty, virtue becomes much easier. Virtue is always going to be a struggle, but when it's grounded, when you know that people who loved God, created so much beauty to his glory, it changes you. And I think that man was really onto something.
Yeah, that's exactly Lewis's men with chess point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's excellent.
Well, thank you both. Thank you for staying up a little bit past midnight, Rod, and we will let you go so you can get a good night's sleep. And thank you, Bethel,
Merci,
for jumping
merci.
in.
Thank you.
And
Yes,
I will end the recording, but we will look forward to seeing you both in Chicago in August. So
It's going to be fun. Everybody come. We're going to
are
have
we
a
going to make a
blast.
pilgrimage to the Pope's house? Wait.
What?
Pope Bob's house.
No, no, no. I imagine there'll be beer there, and if there's beer there, Rod's going to tell some woo stories. So
Oh,
everybody gather around.
There you go. Come for the woo. Come for the
okay.
woo. All right.
Midwestuary 2025, August 22nd through the 24th, in Elmhurst, Illinois. A weekend you won't want to miss, with special guests Cale Zeldin, Paul Vanderklay, Rod Dreher, Elizabeth Oldfield, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Pajot. Midwestuary 2025, The Fellowship of the Spirit. Stay tuned for more details. Visit us at midwestuary.com for ongoing updates.